On the cusp of Confederation in 1867, Ontario was obviously a very different place. For one thing, the population of the entire province was just more than half the current population of the city of Toronto. With festivities on the near horizon for the sesquicentennial, we wanted to know what Ontario's leading towns and cities looked like all those years ago and what their relationship was like with the Indigenous people who'd already been here for thousands of years. To help us find out, we welcome, in the nation's capital, Charlotte Gray, historian and author most recently of The Promise of Canada, 150 Years, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country. And here in studio, Heidi Boecker, Professor of History at the University of Toronto, and Victoria Freeman, Professor of History at York University, and we're delighted to have Charlotte, you back on the program here once again, and you two here in the studio. Great to have you alongside as well. Charlotte, I do want you to start us off and take us back to 1867 and just give us a sense about what the living conditions of Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario were like 150 years ago.
Well, if we're talking about the Ontarians who lived in towns and cities, in fact, we're talking about people who lived in still very small communities, and communities that were only just beginning to be linked up by the railway boom that had begun in the late 1850s. Their lives were very constrained. They were constrained by poverty for most of them. Each small town, little town like Brockville or Belleville, Coburn, they would have maybe one or two wealthy people who lived in nice brick houses, but most people were at subsistence levels. And in fact, the majority of the settler community, in fact, were still on pioneer farms, just making do by feeding themselves and maybe being able to raise an extra pig or sell some of their wheat in the local market. Also, the great innovation was, get it, gas lamps. No electricity yet, very little communication between these communities.
Well, no electricity, and Heidi, we're 50 years away from cars, so without necessarily being too graphic here.
Horses.
So what did Ontario smell like back then?
Horse poop, especially in the urban areas, for sure. It was the principal means of transportation. Now, urban people, especially as Charlotte alluded to, people who were poor did not own horses, and of course there was, just like today, a lively taxi business, but that would have been with horse taxis or cabs. And wealthy people, of course, kept their own stables. And with, just like today, with increasing amounts of income, you had fancier carriages and fancier horses to go with that.
And I guess Toronto back then, I mean, wouldn't even have gone to Eglinton, right? Wouldn't even have gone to Bloor.
No, yeah, just a bit north. And if you look at pictures from the time period, or even some of the early photographs, you see large plots of green spaces between houses, and even as urban development was growing and there was suburbanization across the Don Valley, you'll have a house and then quite a few plots of vacant land, so a lot greener.
Victoria, tell us about Ontario's Indigenous people 150 years ago. What was their life like?
Well, they were certainly, for the most part, being increasingly marginalized from cities and excluded from urban development. Cities were very much part of the process of settler colonialism, and they were establishing little Englands in a way, in their architecture, in the way that they used land, so that there was a spatial dynamic being created that really excluded Indigenous people for the most part. That doesn't mean they were completely absent from cities, but mainly they were in more rural areas on reserve.
Well, if we can, Sheldon, let's bring up this map of what Ontario looked like back in 1867, and there we are. Great Lakes, of course. We're on Lake Ontario still. Heidi, the population of Ontario back then, as we suggested in the intro, basically like half of Toronto today.
Half of Toronto today, and most of that population was rural. And even when you look at that map, you have to remember that the most settler population was south of the Canadian Shield, so south of Barrie on the Ontario Peninsula. That extension of Ontario into the Great Lakes watershed was through the Robinson-Huron treaties of 1850 and Robinson-Superior treaties, and those, but they weren't populated with large numbers of white settlers.
Charlotte, I'm curious. The War of 1812 is 5.5 decades behind us in 1867, but I do wonder whether or not You know, it's 2 years after the end of the Civil War in the United States. So how worried were we about another invasion from down south?
Well, the Fenians had posed a terrific threat at the Irish, who were actually just trying to agitate in British North America in the 1860s to get some results in Ireland. These were the Irish Americans who were dying for a fight and came roaring over the roaring into Ontario, and were actually repelled pretty easily. I do think, though, that it's important to remember that we're talking about Ontario in 1867, but nobody in Ontario in that period really thought of themselves as Ontarians. They barely thought of themselves as Canadians. Although we'd had Confederation was sort of on the horizon, if not just being celebrated, these were still little colonies that had joined together as provinces, and they were filled with people who identified themselves by their origins or their religion. So that there were Yankees, they were Irish, they were English, they were Protestants, French-speaking Canadians in Ontario, and it was a fractious, fragmented, incoherent society with no sense of being loyal to the province particularly, let alone the country.
Well, let's get you to follow up if we can. I want to hear more about the city that you find yourself in right now. The nation's capital, you know, hadn't been the nation's capital for all that long. What did the city look like?
Well, it had been the nation's capital for just over 10 years, and it had these marvelous Gothic Parliament buildings, which gave a sense of the big ambitions for the future. But if you stood on Parliament Hill and looked around you, you'd see two things. One would be the immense wealth of this land, as at this time of year the logging rafts came thundering down the Ottawa River and the Gatineau River. And the other was how the capital, in fact, was really nothing more than a jumped-up lumber town, and pretty squalid at that. In amongst the public buildings, whether we're talking about the Parliament buildings or the convents or the churches, in amongst those buildings there were just sort of clapboard shacks, and it was pretty ghettoized. There were the Irish and French Roman Catholics in Lower Town, there were the Protestants around the canal. It was actually not a country, not a city that I would have enjoyed at all then. One of the comments from many of the public servants who had to move here when it was made the capital, and they were pretty upset at having to move here from Quebec City, which they'd been living in previously, was how bad this place smelt. It smelt of the lumber mills, which smells like cabbage, and they hadn't yet laid any drains.
Victoria, I want to ask you, actually having just come out of the city that the Queen of the same name as you chose to be our capital, let's ask you about the other capital, namely Toronto, capital of the province of Ontario. How'd that look back in 1867?
Well, I can speak mostly to what had happened in terms of Indigenous people in Toronto. So the Mississaugas had been basically forced out of their, crowded out of their territories on the Credit River, which was then not exactly part of Toronto, but on the periphery of Toronto. And they had been unable to get title to their lands. So there's the whole question of the Toronto Purchase, and I would mention that in terms of Ottawa as well.
Tell us what the Toronto Purchase was.
So the Toronto Purchase was in 1787. It was some sort of agreement between the British and the Mississaugas, but it was very improperly recorded. The boundaries were not spelled out. And even the very next year, it was in question when the surveyors attempted to survey the land.
So this is why Premier Wynne, whenever she gives a speech in public in this city, always starts with, she wants to acknowledge she's on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit.
And that land claim was only settled in 2010.
In 2010?
In 2010, yes. So
long time after.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at, can we bring this picture up here, Sheldon? This is the Humber River Valley. It's not 1867, but it's 1919. Hunting grounds. This is quite something. Heidi, people went hunting in the Humber River Valley in 1919?
Absolutely. Again, much of what's now housing development in Toronto, of course, was pasture land, woodlot, because many people burned wood, and those places were ecosystems. The ravine system was full of animals. We still have deer coming into the Don Valley today.
Indeed,
we do,
indeed.
But much more then. So of course people went hunting within the city, and fishing where they could. But the Don River was damaged early on and lost. Atlantic salmon used to run up the Don River.
Now, the big street, I gather, in Toronto at the time was King Street. So let's take a look at that one if we can. Bring up that shot. That's bustling. I mean, not even a road, really.
Well, it's dirt.
It's dirt,
and you can imagine in the summertime with the rain, in the springtime and the fall with the rains, the kinds of conditions you would be driving in your carriage with your horses.
We've talked about Ottawa, the capital of the country. We've talked about Toronto, the capital of the province. I want to add another capital to our list here, and that is the capital city before Ottawa. Once upon a time was Kingston.
That's right.
And you know, before we were actually Canada, we were the United Provinces of Canada, it was the capital for a few years once upon a time. What was it like back in the 19th century?
Much smaller. Toronto, of course, was Confederation was 50,000 people. I think Kingston around Confederation was around 12 or 13,000. So much smaller place. But still having been a seat of government, still having a little more tone, as you might say, than some of the other towns of equivalent size in other parts of the province.
Charlotte, of those three cities we've mentioned, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say Queen's University had already been founded, and Kingston had some very impressive public buildings because it did have pretensions to being the capital for the rest of eternity. So it had not just a wonderful cathedral in the start of its university, but also a marvelous city hall in which the Parliament had originally met.
And fair to say then that therefore Kingston was the most, and I use this word I guess in inverted commas, sophisticated city in Ontario of the time?
I'm sure it would like to have described itself that way, but I think that the sort of Chamber of Commerce mentality was at large in many of these communities, whether we're looking at Kingston or Hamilton. There was a sense that you know, these were communities that were going to grow. The railways the little local railways were starting to make a real difference and give people a sense that they were going to have wider trading opportunities and therefore would become wealthier.
Well, you mentioned Hamilton, and let me pick up on that, because what in Ottawa, I guess you today call OC Transpo, and what we in Toronto call the Toronto Transit Commission, in Hamilton they still call it the HSR, the Hamilton Street Railway. That's what the public transit outfit is called. And can we see a shot now of the Steel City back in the day? Heidi, this town would turn into a major industrial powerhouse for quite a long time. And this is, I guess, 1852 or so in Hamilton. What do you note?
Well, the first thing to note, this is a main street like this, and you see how wide it is, obviously, for parking horse-drawn carriages. The kinds of commercial buildings that are there are set up to bring in the burgeoning manufacturing goods that are beginning. Hamilton, Brantford, Paris with its textile mills, all that community around Hamilton, bringing in the kinds of goods that would be sold in a place like Hamilton. So a major regional center, you know, so a place like Hamilton, London, Ontario also should be on that list.
I think Dundas, even before Hamilton, was kind of like the big city around that area, because they had the place where ships could land, and it was...
Well, if you think in the days of before rail, and I mean, Charlotte's alluded to the transformative effect of rail, but in the days before rail, you know, you might go 20 miles with your horses before you needed to change. So you needed lots of way stations along the way, and this little in-between communities between centers, and so you went to your nearest center. You know, that was for your major shopping expeditions. You didn't come into Toronto. If you were in just outside of Hamilton, you would have come into Hamilton.
Right. Let's put this picture up if we can, Sheldon. This is the immigration poster. Yeah. Now, this is nothing you'd necessarily see today, but this is, okay, Heidi, while you have the floor, this was an effort to get people to move to Ontario from everywhere else. What do you note?
Absolutely. Well, it's a free grant of land, and it's targeting farmers who are renting. And this was this is a critical indicator of the state of the land market in Ontario at Confederation. It was one of the drivers behind Confederation. One of the reasons George Brown of the Globe was looking, for example, to the Northwest Territories in an effort to expand. This was part of his vision for Canada and for Confederation, that as the farms were being granted, and they had been free grants before, or very low-cost grants, but by the 1850s there was very little arable land to be granted, and anyone who's traveled north of Barrie knows you run into the Canadian Shield, and that's not very good farmland, hard to plow, granite. So the need to open up lands for farming, and particularly to target those tenant farmers was really critical, because by the 1860s, I mean, Charlotte's alluded to poverty, but poverty was rising and there were fewer opportunities for young people to secure their livelihood with a farm, because you needed significant capital to enter the land market.
I want to know, Victoria, how much, if any, pushing off Indigenous land there was by the city fathers back in the day in order to accommodate the burgeoning population of the place.
Well,
that's kind of what it was about.
Yeah, certainly in terms of Toronto, the vision of many of the prominent Torontonians was of expanding westward to basically colonize the West in spite of or without consultation, really, for Indigenous people or Métis people already living there. So I think it was very much part of the plan as farmland became increasingly scarce in Ontario to cast a very acquisitive eye westward. So there's a form of internal colonialism within what becomes Canada. And 2 years after Confederation, we have the Red River Resistance in what's now the Winnipeg area. Exactly because of this issue of jurisdiction over the peoples and lands of the Northwest.
This is Louis Riel.
This is Louis Riel.
So you've got a quote. You want to read the quote?
Okay, so this is an earlier quote. This is by Anna Jameson, who came to Upper Canada in 1836, 1837. And her attitude, well, she expresses an attitude to Indigenous people, which I think was very common even in 1867. She said, "They do strike me as an untamable race. There is a bar to the civilization of the Indians and the increase or even preservation of their numbers, which no power can overleap. I can no more conceive of a city filled with industrious Mohawks and Chippewas than I can imagine a flock of panthers browsing in a penfold."
Now, let's not make the mistake of applying 2017 values to something said nearly 200 years ago, but, having said that, what does that reflect?
It reflects the belief that Indigenous people don't belong in urban spaces. And in fact, that Indigenous people are people of the past, they're a vanishing race, and that the newcomers, the settlers, are coming in and creating a new progressive era that really doesn't have a lot of space for Indigenous people.
And the irony here, and we were talking about this earlier, is that if you went to Six Nations in 1867, if you went to the Credit River, New Credit communities, and many of the reserves in Ontario, you would have seen farms. Yes. People who converted to Christianity, who were literate in their languages, but and in English, who reading and writing, who were participating in agricultural fairs, who were contributing to the market economy. Manitoulin Island was supplying the maple sugar needs, or the sugar needs of the city. They were part of the economy. And the other irony is that our cities in Ontario are all on the sites, especially, not all, but certainly like Toronto, the major cities, the oldest places, are originally the sites of trading posts, which themselves were set on places that Indigenous peoples historically gathered. That is, they were historically indigenously urban places.
Especially because they were natural trading posts, because they were on water, which was still a major thoroughfare, the links through the rivers into the lake, and they were crisscross trails that, of course, the settlers had taken over. I just wanted to add one more note to the discussion about Indigenous peoples being pushed off their land. It wasn't simply that they themselves were seen as irrelevant to modernization and to the European civilization that was being, lucky them, foisted on them. It was also that Ontario was very determined to swell its population as fast as possible, because there was still this rivalry with Quebec, and the English-Canadian, French-Canadian rivalries were strong.
While you have the floor then, Charlotte, we're down to our last few minutes, and I want to get from each of you in a minute or so who your, I guess, favorite Ontario character from 150 years ago would be. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Oh, too hard. I would say I'm trying to think of one of those doughty women who were backstopping all the efforts at trying to establish services for women. It would almost inevitably have been a woman associated with the church, because the churches were the only sources of sort of welfare services, nothing from government. And frankly, Steve, I'll come back to you on the name.
Okay. Well, Susanna Moody, should I throw that out there?
She was already a little bit past it by now.
Okay, good enough. Victoria, how about you?
Well, my favorite person is a Mohawk man who absolutely shatters the stereotype of Indigenous people not belonging in cities. He was Aronia Dega, also known as Dr. Peter Martin, and he was the graduate of the University of Toronto Medical School in, I believe, 1866. And later on in Toronto, in the 1890s, he became the CEO of the Independent Order of Foresters, a global fraternal organization, which is now International Foresters, and built the tallest building in the British Empire at Bay in Richmond.
And say his Indigenous name again?
Aronia Dega.
Terrific. Okay, that's a new one. Heidi.
Yeah, Nanabewekwe. And she's Catherine Sutton. Her name also means upright woman. She is from the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and she married a white man named William Sutton. Got a farm up in Owen Sound from a grant from the Chippewas of Nawash, went on missionary tours, then went to England when she found out that her land had been given away underneath her with no title to it, along with other First Nations, because the government had essentially purchased the land and said that the previous farms were invalid. The title was invalid. So she goes all the way to Queen Victoria in 1860. While 8 months pregnant, to have an audience and to achieve a title for her land, and to fight back against what she saw was the wholesale theft of Indigenous land in the province.
Wonderful. Great to have that history on the record. Charlotte, I guess it's just way too pedestrian of me to say an old Kingston boy like John A. Macdonald is an important person in 1867. Yeah, so I won't do that.
He's a very important person, but I think of him in a larger context.
Yes. Gotcha.
Yes.
I understand. I'm being a little bit cheeky with you there. That's okay. Charlotte Gray, The Promise of Canada, 150 Years, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country. That is her latest. We thank as well Heidi Boecker, History Professor, University of Toronto, Victoria Freeman, History Professor, York University. Her latest is Distant Relations, How My Ancestors Colonized North America. Great to have you three on our program tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.